Hopefully everybody will be able to hear me now. They didn't hear him because we turned the mic off here, so that may be the issue. And hopefully, if you can hear me now, text Larissa, all right? If they can't hear me, then I'll know. You know what I'm saying? It's always amazing to me the way this whole thing is working out when it comes to all this just stuff we've got nowadays. Text Larissa. Usually, whenever there's an issue, people will text Larissa and let Larissa know. I went back and it dawned on me we didn't have this microphone on, so that's the reason why that didn't work. And believe it or not, one Sunday I was up there preaching and somebody texted me up there. And I'm like, it's not that important. Later I opened up and found out that they were having issues with the thing, but it's not like I could do anything about it from up there. You know what I'm saying? So they still cannot hear online. All right, give me one more second. Let me try one more thing. If that don't work, I don't know what else to do. Well, okay. A major thing, we will get to the Bible. Romans chapter 3 is where we're beginning tonight. And appreciate again all of you being here, and let's just do what we can to continue to encourage everybody to come on back. I know you can see it online. I know it's easier online a lot of times, but it's not the same as being here. And I just appreciate all of you that do come. Thank you. Thank you so very, very much. All righty. Paul in Romans chapter 1. And I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago when I took Wayne's place. In essence, in Romans chapter 1, he gives a list of every sin that the Gentiles are guilty of. And the list is just, it's, as I've often said, it's just a mass of sin, and just we can't even begin to imagine how bad it is. And I could just see in Romans chapter 1 the Jews saying, "Get them, Paul. They deserve it. They need to be told what they're doing wrong." And then in chapter 2, guess what he does? He turns it on the Jews. And in the last part of Romans chapter 2, where we talked about last week, he says, "Circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law. But if you are a breaker of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? And will not the physically uncircumcised, if he fulfills the law, judge you who, even with your written code and circumcision, are a transgressor of the law?" One of the things that I did in my Bible is I circled every time Paul put the word if. If. He's making the point here that all of the salvation of the Jews is going to be dependent upon what? Their obedience to the law. Let's talk a moment about the law. The law was given to who? Right, to the Jews. When?
At Mount Sinai in the desert.
Right. And who specifically?
To Moses.
There you go. Okay. And so you begin to read through. And how many of you love to read through Leviticus? Nobody's raising their hand. I'm going to hope somebody that's listening online is, okay?
It's interesting to read through Leviticus because it frustrates you to realize that I can't do this.
Right. And that's the whole purpose of the law. The whole purpose of the law is you could not be good enough in and of yourself. You could not keep all the commandments and keep them perfectly enough to be able to go to heaven on your own. And that was what the purpose of the law was, to help people to understand that they needed a Savior, that they needed somebody besides them. If you broke the law in one point, Paul would say in another passage of Scripture, you become what? Guilty of all of it. You become guilty of all of it. It's whatever it is, whatever it was. Lying, cheating, murder, adultery. You name the sin. We categorize the sins worse. This ain't so bad, but this is worse, and this is worse, and this is worse, and this is just the ones you just don't even want to go down, right? But with Paul and with Moses and with God, God's saying it doesn't matter if you do that heinous sin down here or you're doing this one that you think is not a real big deal. You have broken the law, period. Another way we could look at that ideal is, again, think about the ideal of us driving or whatever the laws. How many of you, and I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, how many of you have ever really sat down and studied the Georgia law books? Nobody. Okay, you've studied some of them? Okay, not all of them. You don't have enough time. You don't have a lifetime enough to be able to look at all those laws. The bottom line is, if there's that many laws out there, how are we going to be able to know when we're breaking it? And is it possible that every day we're probably breaking some law somewhere, somehow? Yes. And that's the point. God is saying, this is what it's going to take to come into my presence. You have to keep this law perfectly. The problem is they couldn't do it. So under the Old Testament, they would offer the sacrifice of bulls and goats and blood of lambs. In the New Testament, we have the blood of Christ. And that's the whole point that Paul is trying to make. He's telling these Jews in this particular place in Romans chapter 2, he says, a true Jew is the one who is not one outwardly, but is one that's inwardly. He is a Jew that is one inwardly. Circumcision is of the heart and the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but of God. Now, Paul concludes that there. Remember that Paul didn't break this into chapters and verses, so he just immediately goes to the next point. Here's the point, beginning in chapter 8, or chapter 3, verse 1. And then what advantage then has the Jew, or what is the profit of circumcision? If Jews are like the Gentiles and they've all broken the law, then is there any advantage to having a Jew or to being a Jew? No. No. You're just as bad as the Gentiles, Paul's saying. And they're really struggling with that. We were God's special people. We have been chosen out of everybody. We are Abraham's descendants. And now you're telling me that we're no better than they are? Yeah, that's it. That's kind of what it boils down to. Why did God want to do this? So that he would convince that all men are under sin and show that all men need the gospel. And that's his point. So is there any advantage at that time to being a Jew? No. Any advantage to being circumcised? Absolutely not. No. But then he also says, much in every way. Well, then what advantage did they have? What advantage did they have? God gave them the law. But if you can't keep it, what good is it? What good is it? And that's the whole point that he's trying to make. To them were committed the oracles of God. Going back to what I was saying a moment ago, given to Moses on Mount Sinai, right? And again, whenever we read through Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, our head spins. We're grateful that we're not under that. Just think about how every day you would have to study that as a Jew and make sure you didn't do anything like that. If you did, what? You'd have to offer a sacrifice of an animal. And all these Jews were holding on to the fact that, hey, we are God's special people because God chose us out of all the people on the earth. And Paul says, no, that's not cutting it. That's not cutting it. What do they need to know? You had received, and to you were committed the oracles of God. But what if some of them did not believe? Well, there was a lot of them that didn't believe, right? Think about the idea of many of those Jews that had to be punished in the wilderness, that whole generation. Their lack of faith caused them to be wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. That whole generation had to perish. So you start off with a clean slate as Joshua takes over. It's not far into the book of Joshua that what happens? There's a fellow by the name of Achan who stole a Babylonian garment from the first city they conquered. And as a result, whenever the Israelite armies go up against the next one, they get defeated soundly, and they're saying, what happened? And God says, just one of you did something you shouldn't have done. And that's affecting everybody. True or false? Sin affects every one of us in one way or another. Even if you're not the one that did it, you are still affected by it. We all are affected by it. And one of the things that I think a lot about heaven is the fact that there's not going to be any sin there. And I can't really wrap my mind totally around that idea because I live in a sin-cursed world. Can you imagine being in a place where there is no sin? There is total peace. Okay? Total peace. You're at peace with God. You're at peace with those that have come through there or come through it. So he's asking the question. He said, well, what if some of these Jews did not believe? Will their unbelief make the faithfulness of God without effect? So here's the question that Paul then begins to answer. The Jews had the law. Some of them did not believe the law. They had to be punished because they did not believe the law. So will their unbelief make the faithfulness of God without effect? No. Their unbelief is not going to affect the promises that God has made to his people. When we have members of the church today that don't buy into everything that the Bible says, when we have them that are struggling with the faith, and look, true or false, all of us somewhere down the line are going to struggle with our faith, right? We do it, we struggle with it. It's not fair. Some things are really, we don't understand why it's working out that way. And in essence, what he's saying is this. When we struggle with our faith, does that make the faithfulness of God of no effect? No. God is still faithful to do what God said he would do. Now, going back to the very beginning of time, before man sinned, he promised that from the seed of Adam and Eve was going to come one that was going to save the world, especially specifically mentioned in Genesis 3:15, right after they did sin. We again read about it in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 7, where David is going to be the one, this particular person is going to come through the seed of David. You see Isaiah prophesying about Jesus over and over and over and over again. All of God's plan was all centered about Jesus. And this is the point that Paul is trying to get everybody to. He says, their unbelief will not cause God not to be faithful. But God is going to be faithful, no problems. And that's what he says. Certainly not. Let God be true, but what? but every man be a liar. Now, what again is Paul doing here? He's dealing with the objections the Jews were having. Well, are you saying that being circumcised doesn't count for anything? Yeah, that's kind of what it boils down to. And the Gentiles, if they kept the law better than we do, they have a better chance? Yeah. But actually, in another sense, while they might not have the law and know what the law says, if they by nature do what the law says, they're acceptable to God. So even a Gentile would know that it's wrong to murder. Even a Gentile would know it's wrong to steal from somebody. Even a Gentile would know that adultery would be wrong. List all the sins. And by their own teaching and so forth, they would have understood this. So what's he saying is to the Jew, even though they had a lot of advantages, the most important advantage they had was the fact that God gave them his revelation. But even though he blessed them with his revelation, they were still unfaithful. Even though they had the superior knowledge as it was. But their unfaithfulness is not affecting God's faithfulness. And that's the point that Paul makes. What faithfulness God has. He made a promise of someone coming to take care of the sins of the world. And just because man messed up all the way along, just because the Jews messed up all the way along, does not mean that God give up on trying to save us. We're here tonight because he has. We're here this afternoon and so forth, studying these things because this is what he's done. Now, think about what God is doing here. He's faithful. He's still true, even though every man on the face of this earth can be false. He's still going to do what's right. Even when the Jews' injustice had the effect to display the justice of God, God still has to punish their what? Their injustice, their sin. He has to punish their unrighteousness. And God is right in doing so. Some of them would actually say, well, let us do evil that good may come. No. That doesn't make sense either. You do the evil, what's going to happen? You're going to be punished. We don't talk a lot about God's punishment anymore either, do we? Not from the pulpit. Used to, you would hear, and I remember, and I think I've told you this before, that sermon I had to read, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. That's a tough sermon. That's a tough sermon the way he described, what's going to happen there. But the thing is that's still true. God is still going to punish sin. He has already punished sin, in one sense, by laying all the sin on his Son. And when his Son had to die, then the Son paid the debt. And that's the beautiful part of this as we're looking about this, as we think about this for just a moment. What he's trying to emphasize here is that God is going to do what's right. And again, notice this chapter has a lot of quotes from the Old Testament. Why? He's talking to the Jews. And they would sit back and say, okay, prove it. All right, let's quote from the Old Testament. And the first quote is found in verse 4. You may be justified in your words and I may overcome when you are judged. That is a quote from Psalms 51 verse 4. I'm writing smaller. The glasses ain't cutting it anymore. Y'all still love me, right? And I'm waiting for somebody to say, I wish I could tell you it's going to get better. But it's not, right? There you go. All right, I've said it. So there, having said that. So the thing is, God said, you may be justified in your words and may overcome when you are judged. All right? So Paul is quoting from the Old Testament scriptures to emphasize the idea that God is going to be faithful to his law, to his commands, and he's going to be true. Every man is going to be a liar. And again, that you here is referencing God. You may be justified in your words, and you may overcome when you are judged. Now, think about the idea as you're looking at all of this. He's stressing the idea that God is true. God is not a liar. God is all of this. So he says, God himself prophesied that he was going to judge it all. In Genesis 18, verse 25, Abraham asked this great question: shall not the God of the universe do what's right? Yeah. So you see, even Abraham understood that. Even Abraham believed that point. So, David again said, whenever he committed the sin with Bathsheba, now, did he sin against Bathsheba's husband? Yes. What did he do? He had him killed, right? But it's always interesting to me if you look at the Psalms, in Psalms 51, he will say to God, against thee, thee only have I sinned and done this evil in thy sight. No, you sinned against others as well, David. But as he was looking at this whole situation, he was more concerned about his relationship with God. And so we have to realize, as you're looking at this, God's righteous. God cannot stand the sight of sin. God still made a plan to save man despite ourselves, despite what we're doing. David acknowledged, Psalms 51, as I said earlier, that God was righteous in punishing him. And so he is emphasizing, again, stressing this idea that you will overcome when they are judged. Now, here's what he's trying to bring out in verse 5. If our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, let's picture it this way. We buy a brand new car and we park it beside a junkyard car. Now, the junkyard car hasn't been taken care of. It's dented. It can't go anywhere. They've stripped it of its motor. They've stripped it of its tires. They've stripped it of just about anything. All it is, in essence, is what? It just boils down to what? Junk. And then you compare this with a brand new vehicle. Bad analogy in one respect, but there's still that point. God's righteousness is the new vehicle. Brian, it's perfect in every way. Our unrighteousness is like the junkyard car. That's the way he looks at it. That's the way we need to look at it. That's the reason why the challenge for every Christian is what? For us to strive for the righteousness of God. By the way, what does the word righteousness mean? Huh?
To be right.
To do right, yeah. To do right. To be right, like God. And isn't that the challenge for all of us? To be God-like? What does the word godly mean? To be God-like. So, if our unrighteousness, if our sin demonstrates the righteousness of God, if you compare our sin with his righteousness, you see such a difference. So what shall we say? Is God wrong in punishing the unrighteousness? No, because it goes against everything he is. And he says this, he said, is God unjust who inflicts wrath? I speak as a man. No. How can God judge the world? On the day of Pentecost, Peter preached about the fact that there was coming a day in which God was going to judge the world. As you go through the preaching of Paul, they bring that ideal of judgment up over and over and over again. Here, as he's writing to the Romans, a place that he has not had the opportunity to be with yet, he's reminding them God is going to come and judge the world one of these days. Us not saying anything about judgment isn't going to change anything. He's still going to judge the world. And perhaps, talking about me, perhaps that's part of the reason because we have not said that much about it, because preachers have not preached enough about it, and I'll be the first to confess that maybe I haven't said enough about it. Maybe we've kind of put it in the back of our mind and we're not that worried about it, not that concerned about it. If we truly believed that God is coming in judgment, would that make us more evangelistic? Yeah, because we wouldn't want anybody that we love to go there, right? Would that make us more, if I thought about the judgment of God and it could happen at any moment, would I be thinking more about the sins in my own life and what I've got to work on, and will I work at it a little bit harder not to be engaged in that? Will I ever be perfect at it? No, because we again live in a sinful world, and we get to that point to where, what I see sometimes, and this is just me, is that because we've lost the ideal of God's judgment, we're kind of lackadaisical in our Christianity. We're not teaching others the gospel of Christ. We're not living as we should. We're kind of saying, okay, and I've had some brethren kind of tell me this, not so many words, but they kind of have the attitude, well, what's the least I can get by with? Make sure that I get my ticket punched. Is that really the attitude that a Christian needs to have? Absolutely not. A Christian needs to look at it from the viewpoint, look what Christ has done for me, and isn't this what Paul, and isn't this even what Jesus emphasized? He said, I'm going to die for you. And he says, by the way, and he's telling his apostles this and his disciples this right before he died, he said the same thing's going to happen to you. Are we willing to die for Christ? Well, we're not to that point. We like to sit back and say, well, in our mind, well, yeah, I'd like to think that I am. But we don't have anybody coming and knocking out the door now and arresting all of us and throwing us in jail at this moment in time, do we? So we're not really that worried about it. And maybe that's part of the reason why we have become a little less fervent, a little less zealous about worship, about living a Christian life, about teaching others the gospel, about being the light to the world. Thoughts? Comments?
We think of judgment is something in the future that doesn't really doesn't really concern us, because that's something that's going to happen somewhere else.
Right.
It's not like if you get stopped by the state patrol out on the highway going way too fast and they give you a ticket, and they say you got to show up in court and pay this fine.
Right.
And it is the same thing. It's we're being judged, we're being watched, and we're going to have to pay for the sins that we commit one way or the other.
Right.
So we're either going to live for Christ or we're going to
Pay the penalty. That's right. That's exactly right.
I'm not sure we won't pay the fine.
I'm pretty sure we don't. It's interesting you use that. I was talking to my son Brandon, and he's on the DUI task force here in Cobb County. And he was studying the other day. He had to go back and restudy a video that he did where he pulled over somebody for DUI because it took 2 years to get it to court. 2 years. Years, okay? 2 years. And he said, I'm just kind of ticked off, Dad, because this guy won't plead out, because literally 2 days after Brandon stopped him, another Cobb County police officer stopped him and gave him another ticket for driving under the influence. Now, the point I'm trying to make is, no punishment. I don't have to worry about it. I may have to pay a little fine, maybe spend 30 days in jail. No big deal, but I'm going to go do what I want to do anyway. That's the attitude of the world, right? Has the attitude of the world infected us in the church? Yeah, I think it has. It really has. Well, okay.
Wednesday night, Sunday morning,
Yeah.
all the times, this world would be a lot better place.
Right.
We would learn more. We would know.
Right. And that's exactly right. And what is our job as a Christian? To go outside the doors and teach the gospel. And are we really doing that well? No, we're not. And again, we're busy living our own lives, and we don't think about that these folks are going to be eternally lost if we don't do something, if we don't at least give them a chance. Paul here has emphasized the idea that our unrighteousness demonstrates God's righteousness. So if that's the case, what shall we say? Is God wrong in punishing us if we are engaged in unrighteousness? No. Has he warned about it? Yes. What did he do? He gave the Ten Commandments and all the laws there in the Old Testament. When we come into the New Testament, did Jesus break the Ten Commandments? No. What did he do? He kind of notched that thing up to a higher level, right? As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So again, Jesus would say, is murder wrong? Yes. But he said, if you're even thinking about doing it, you've already sinned.
Well, he says, if you say to your brother, I hate you, which is what raka means. If I hate you, I hate you. I wish you dropped it.
Right.
I've as much as killed you.
Right.
In my heart. And that's as bad, Jesus says, as if I took a gun and shot you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's now he's talking about it's a way of life. It's not just what you do, it's what you think.
Right.
And we have enough trouble with what we do, let alone what we think.
What we think. But it's our thoughts that what? Control our actions. That's right.
She said if more people came to services, I think we do well to start with if more people started by studying. we wouldn't have to fight the battle of more people coming to services.
Mm-hmm.
I studied long before I came to services.
Mm-hmm.
Then I came to services because I wanted to come to services.
Right.
Not because you insisted I come to services.
Right.
Or the elders insisted or my parents insisted I come to services.
Mm-hmm.
Once I studied, I wanted to come to services.
That's right. You wanted that relationship with God,
I wanted that relationship.
and you want that relationship with people that are like-minded. The thing that, again, we're trying to get across here, remember the context. He had been talking to the Jews in chapter 2. Now they're sitting back and saying, what good is it to be a Jew if what you're saying is true, Paul? And he says, well, let me emphasize this idea. You had the oracles of God. He said there were many Jews that because of their unbelief, but that didn't change God's faithfulness. Let God be true and every man be a liar. If our, verse 5, if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unjust who inflicts wrath? No. Certainly not. For then how will God judge the world? And so that's the key things we need to be thinking about. Have you ever thought about the fact that we judge God sometimes? We do. If I don't like the idea that God is going to judge me on the day of judgment, what will I do? I'll make me a God that's not going to judge me on the day of judgment. If I have a sin in my life that I really, really, really like, but the Bible makes it clear that I shouldn't be engaged in that, I'll just make me a God that lets me do what I want to do. That's where the whole idolatry thing started. We think we can make our own gods, and then when our gods are going to do exactly the way we think, rather than us listening to what God says and doing that.
We live in a society now that's so much, let's do it my way. Everybody wants to do it their way.
Right.
And that's what we have to
That's right.
teach people,
Make them want to understand. And again, could it be that maybe we would do a better job if, like the apostles and so forth, we just tell the world up front, listen, folks, God is going to judge this world, and guess what? It's not going to be according to what you think, but according to what he says. Maybe we just kind of need to start off with that idea. Whenever you start off with that idea, then folks may get woke up to the reality that, now they may dismiss your thoughts and they may say you're crazy and walk away, but hopefully you've planted a seed. What if this guy was right and I'm wrong? maybe I need to get this book out and study it a little bit. Well, some of them's not going to, but because that's what they want to do. The thing is that, and that's the point that I think I wanted to really try to get across, is that we a lot of times do make God to make a God in our image, because he's going to let me get away with what I want to get away with and do what I want to do. And that's not the God of the Bible. We are to be made into his image, not make him into our image. Right? So that's the key thing. So he says, God will judge the world. Now, in verse 7, he says, if the truth of God has increased through my lie to his glory, why am I still judged as a sinner? What's he trying to say there in verse 7? Well, think about the idea that he says this. He's still addressing the Jews. And again, the Christians didn't judge Paul this way, but the Jews did. So what he's trying to emphasize here is he says, look, the misunderstanding that some of these have about the subject matter, Paul is saying, look, he's not abusing the doctrine of salvation by grace. Now, let's talk about this for a moment. In the book of Romans, there's been a lot of denominations that have taken this book and made it say a lot of things that God never intended to say. Are we saved by grace? Absolutely. Every person that is saved will be saved by grace. By God's grace. Does that grace mean that I don't have to do anything? No, it doesn't. That grace means that I have to listen to what God says and do it his way. So again, as you read so many of the people that make God in their own image, they will emphasize the idea that we're saved by grace, and I'm not going to argue with that in the least little bit. That's exactly true. We need to be preaching that all the time. But let us not go to the opposite extreme, saying grace is going to let us get away with every sin and God's still going to let us in. Because that's not true either. And that's the thing that we need to realize. They're having a distortion here. They don't understand this. They really are struggling with this idea of, okay, you're saying that the law isn't any good, and we've been trying to follow the law all along, and how well did the Jews do that? Not very, because it was so hard. So what did the Pharisees do? They would pick out the ones that they thought were more important than others, right? And think about it, whenever Jesus would ask the question, about being saved, and he says, well, keep the law, and he says, which ones? Right? They always ask that question, which one? Give me the list of the ones that I've got to really be concerned about so I don't have to worry about the rest of them. And then Jesus will do this. He will sum the whole law up in what? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And as we begin to walk that walk, we begin to understand, well, yeah, that sums everything up, but man, that's true or false. Sometimes it's hard to love other folks. Sometimes it's hard to love a God that we've never seen. Sometimes it's hard to have faith in a Jesus who died on the cross for us, and we believe it just because the Bible says it. But isn't that what faith is? Faith is the, Hebrews 11, substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. I've not seen Jesus, but I believe that he came and he died on the cross. I have not seen God, but we're here. So the only other explanation is what? The theory of evolution, but they never can tell us where that little bitty piece of antimatter came from to begin with. And then over the you've got to have billions, probably even trillions of years for it to happen to where we are right now. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. I'm sorry. I just can't have that kind of faith. So that's the point that he's trying to make. God will judge the world. And so he says this. He's emphasizing the idea. if God's truth has increased through my lie to his glory, why am I still judged as a sinner? So he's telling the truth. He's not lied about any of this. And so again, he's mainly talking to the Jews that were what? Still thinking that they were going to be justified by law keeping. And they couldn't do it. They've proven they couldn't do it. They would be concerned about the big things and let the other things slide. And have you also noticed this? And I kind of brought this idea out a moment ago, but I'll bring it out again. What's a big thing to you isn't going to be a big thing to me. Right? And what's a big thing to me isn't necessarily going to be a big thing to you. So think about this whole idea. As you're looking at what he's trying to say here, he says, why shouldn't we say, let us do evil that good may come? As we are slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say, and he said their condemnation is just. Remember again the context. This is what some of the Jews were saying about him. And they were saying, Paul, you just go around telling everybody, let's just do evil that good may come. You talk about God's grace. Now again, that's the problem. A lot of folks in the religious world, they talk so much about God's grace, they never talk about obedience. Never. They never say nothing about obedience. And if that's the case, then every person on this planet is going to make it. And if that's the case, then why are we here tonight? Why are we reading the Scriptures? If everybody's going to make it, well, I just can't believe in a God that actually will punish somebody. Well, you see now when you said that, what have you done? Now you've got to make a God in your own image. You're now committing idolatry. Guess what? You've just sinned.
But there are a world of people who
Do just that. Yeah, they do. They believe that. They don't want to pick up the Bible. They don't want to listen to what the Word says. And that's where, again, we've got to understand why it's important that we try to emphasize what he's saying. He says, we have been slanderously reported. And he said, you know what? Let good be evil. This is what the Jewish objectors were saying to Paul. If your method of judging is right, then why don't you just do evil so that you may get more grace? I believe there's some out there saying that too. Well, because grace covers everything, I can get away with anything. No. Why would you even think that way? If you're going to be like the Lord, if you're going to have your sins washed away by the blood of Christ, and they are, he doesn't want to leave us just at the baptistry. He's telling us now what? I expect you to be sanctified, which means I want you to be set apart. I want you to be holy. I want you to do what I'm telling you to do. So a lot of times maybe we have left people at the baptistry without teaching them more and more and more about what they need to do to be faithful. Think about in the church. What do we say marks a person as faithful in the church? Attendance and giving. You get those two, you've got it. You got your ticket punched. Okay? Then COVID hit. Well, now what are we supposed to do? I know. We'll just watch it on TV. And again, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm grateful that we had that for that period of time, but
there were a lot of people before COVID hit
yeah,
who
just walked away. Yeah.
think, well, my mom was faithful and my
Yeah.
dad was faithful, so I'm good.
Yeah. And, you know, as long as mom and dad are faithful, or as long as this person's faithful, no, it's going to be kind of an individual judgment. He's not going to judge families. He's going to judge us for what we've done. He's not going to judge me for what y'all have done, and vice versa. So you see, this is where they were thinking, and you see, this is the Jewish way of thinking, but may I submit that this is exactly the way a lot of members of the church today think. And we've got to be careful. So what does make a faithful person in God's sight? A person who has obeyed the gospel of Christ and is living their life, her life, his life in such a way to where they're trying to be obedient. They're trying to become more holy on a day-by-day basis. By the way, it's not just my job. God's going to help me to do that. I can't be holy on my own, right? Tommy, do I need to walk around all day long and just say the prayers like the Pharisees did and let everybody look at me and say, boy, that must be a holy man because he's constantly praying, constantly praying. If we didn't believe in God's grace, probably every word coming out of our mouth should be, Lord, forgive me. Lord, forgive me. Lord, please forgive me. Lord, forgive me. Forgive me, Lord, forgive me. Why? Because maybe I've sinned in thought. And yeah, on the day of judgment, what? He's going to judge the very thoughts of men. He's going to judge what's in our hearts. And maybe that's the reason why some people just feel like they can't do it, because they think it's all on them. And what Paul is trying to bring out in this book, it's not all on you. You can't be good enough. You can't keep the law perfectly. You Jews that tried to do it, you tried to pick out what's the most important thing, but that's not how you're going to be justified. It took Jesus' death on the cross. So now I trust not in my doing and my actions, but I trust in Jesus' blood to forgive me. But does that give me a pass into doing nothing? Nope. Nope. So he's just saying, in essence here, this is what we need to understand. He says some people are slanderously reporting, and he's saying, in essence, let's do evil that good may come. So the more we sin, the more God's grace is evident. And if that's the case, what? Boy, we need to be sinning all the time so that God's grace will just shine forth like everything. That's where they are going in all of this. Have you ever noticed that people are we kind of go from one extreme to the other? We don't stay in the middle ground. We really don't. We just go all over the place. We get fired up about something and we're really all, and we don't think about somebody that doesn't necessarily agree with us over there. Now, don't get me wrong, but the question always needs to be is, all right, I need to be doing this, I need to be doing this, but what about all these other things? What about opening my eyes to those who need my help? What about helping somebody that are down on their luck? Well, that's one thing, but okay, then should I attend worship? Well, yeah, I need to attend worship. Well, okay, then what else do I need to be doing? And a lot of times, I've had people ask me, Tommy, what do I need to be doing? And I used to give them a whole list of things, and that's not what a preacher needs to do. I just smile at them now and say, read the Bible. Do what it says. The parts that you don't like that much, work harder at it. Right? The struggles that you have, work harder at that. This is the moment we become a Christian was just the birth. We've got the rest of our lives to grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ. And whenever we are growing and constantly striving to grow and be what God wants us to be, then we have the promise that His blood will continue to cleanse us from sin. It's whenever we get our back up and stop doing things. True or false? In the last couple of years, because of COVID, I'm going to confess, we've kind of backed off on a lot of things, right? I haven't been to a nursing home since all this started. I've not been allowed to go into the hospital since this thing got started. Okay? That frustrates me. I have preached a couple of funerals. The thing I'm trying to get across is because of what the world was going on, we've dialed back on a lot of stuff. I try to call folks. But again, it's not the same, is it? Of being there, seeing them, talking to them face to face. It's not. It's not. So I could beat myself up and say, well, it's not like it used to be, therefore I just need to quit. Or I could say, okay, I'm going to adapt to this situation. Eventually I'll get back to what I'm doing. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to give up. We can't give up. We've got to get back doing what we've been doing as a Christian, as a church. We've got to remind ourselves And I believe this with all of my heart. We've got to remind ourselves that our job is to preach the gospel to every creature. We are not going to save anybody. Did you hear that? We can't save anybody. Jesus does that. But we need to be his feet, his hands, his eyes, his ears. And we can teach a lot of people. And it's up to them then to make the decision.
It is interesting that Peter, Paul, James, and John all teach that we are to grow spiritually. Not just be baptized, but to grow
Right.
spiritually. The fruits of the Spirit. Peter will say, add your faith, knowledge, virtue, etc. All four of those, and even Jude will say, grow spiritually. You need to grow spiritually. And yet we think that coming to services 2 or 3 times a week or once a week
Yeah.
will suffice to
Right.
grow spiritually. Growing spiritually is like eating. If I ate once a week, I'd have starved to death a long time ago. You probably don't have to eat as much as I do, but you could study more.
Right. Those of you that didn't hear, the bottom line is that we've got to eat, we've got to grow, and we can't do that just once a week, you know. I'd like to eat once a week, then all this weight would probably start shedding, but the bottom line is that's going to be a rough way to do it, and the moment I start eating again, what's going to happen? You know, but you see what I'm trying to say. And I appreciate what Bruce is saying there in that respect. That's our job. We are to grow. We are to be better. We are to constantly be the examples of what God wants us to be. Will we keep the New Testament law perfectly? No. Did the Old Testament Jews keep the law, Old Testament, perfectly? Absolutely not. When you start looking that there were probably 660-something laws just in Leviticus and Exodus and Numbers. And then, this is interesting, then after it was all said and done, right before Moses died, what did he do in the book of Deuteronomy? He repeated all that all over again. What do we call Deuteronomy? It's the second law. It's not the second law. It's not like he's adding it, but he does change some things. They're no longer going to be wandering. They're now what? The second bell ring? Okay. They're no longer going to be wandering, but what? They're going to be stationary. Here's how it's going to apply now that you're not walking all over the place. It is 8:03.
I don't think they ring a second bell on Wednesday night. You get one bell on Wednesday night.
Okay, we get one bell on Wednesday night. We're done. Isn't there times whenever you would, let me, before I go any further, isn't there times you'd like to do that when I'm up there? We're going to pick up with verse 9 of chapter 3 next week. Thank you. Appreciate it.